There's nothing that really identifies you as a refugee other than people identifying you as a refugee. And I remember when we first arrived, we arrived in Pornic in Wellington, at the airport there, and immigration officers ended up splitting my family apart. And that moment I remember very vividly, and that's when kind of, I think, reality started to sink in, and I was like, why are we being separated from our father? And it was, forcibly separated, not like a, you go there, you go there. It was very much ripping us apart.
And how old were you at this time? Four.
Yeah, and that's something that I can still very vividly remember today. The police officer, having me in her arms, kind of pulling me off my dad. Same thing with my siblings. That moment has stayed with me for a long time.
I'm Guled Mire, and I'm a community advocate and a Muslim African New Zealander born in Somalia who arrived in Aotearoa as a child refugee. We've finally begun to address our nation's mental health crisis, but the discussions tend to exclude people who look like me, my friends, and my family. This is Third Culture Minds. The past is never the past. This is particularly the case for people who've experienced forced migration. In this episode, I sit down with PhD candidate Bilal Nasier to unpack our traumas of the past and look at how our experiences as young people and the experiences of our parents and grandparents help shape our mental health and well-being journey. Bilal Nasier fled the Afghanistan civil war with his family, aged 4, traveling for 3 months to come to Aotearoa. He now dedicates his life to supporting young people in New Zealand navigate their own traumas and develop positive mental health. Talk me through what that was like in terms of being a refugee and constantly having to move to places.
4 months' time in a 4-year-old's life, that's a significant period of your life at that time. Being told for that amount of time to not say anything, to keep quiet, to not know what tomorrow holds for you. You've gone through that, and then I end up here, and I'm dropped into year 1 of primary school. And now I'm here along my peers who've been born here, who've had, multiple generations who've been living here. And we're all on the same, I guess, apparently the same, level playing field. And nobody's aware that this is what my family had been through until those rumors start to spread and people start to realize that actually you don't speak English. And why is that? And then the teacher makes a comment about, Bilal or such and such is from this country or he's had this experience, with great intentions of trying to educate the class. But then what does that do to that student or to that child at that point in time in relation to their peers? You become that other very early on. Oh, what's Afghanistan like? Or, well, how did your family even get here? And all these questions that, all of a sudden I came under the microscope and people were asking me 101 questions a day. And I needed the answers for them, but actually for me too. And so I was asking my parents more and more of those questions. There are very much things still to this day that they kind of just shrug off and say, that's not something that you need to know about or that you need to worry about. They're trying to protect me from that trauma that they've experienced and that they'd never wish on anybody else.
This is Dr. Samira Ahmed, a former refugee and UK-based doctor and mental health champion. She works to confront and debunk mental health stigmas in her community and improve awareness about mental health and access to healthcare services.
I come across a lot of Somali patients, particularly mothers and older generation, who I do recognize a lot of their symptoms are related to mental health, even if they don't recognize it as such. And trying to speak to them within that setting is quite difficult because they come from a mindset where you just have to toughen up. And that's one subsection of it with the older community. But I find that kids who are from refugee backgrounds in particular can sometimes find it difficult to adjust with the new setting in university. And a lot of them have been harboring deep-rooted trauma that they haven't actually dealt with. And that comes to light and to surface when they have to deal with the stress of exams or deadlines and so on and so forth. And sometimes it becomes a wake-up call for some of them when I tell them, actually, you're depressed. Actually, some of the symptoms you're describing is related to anxiety. Have you considered that? And so I decided that it would be best to address it outside the clinical setting, normalize it essentially in the first place, to allow more people to understand some of their symptoms, uncover some of these deep-rooted trauma, but also allow them to see that they're not alone in this, because it can be quite isolating when you're suffering with mental health.
You talked about how your parents never really had a conversation with you, to sit down with you, to talk to you about, okay, Bilal, this is the situation we find ourselves in, and has that caused more harm?
As I got older, I was exposed to more and more of that story. So it started off with like, yes, son, we have come from Afghanistan, we have had this experience, but we're here now, look at our life, you know? And then it was, this is why we had to leave, or this is what happened, or we had a rocket-propelled grenade into our house and almost explode while we were all sitting there. So, you know, you can't say that to a 4-year-old child, because for them to be able to deal with that emotionally, to be able to understand the implications of that, it's just so, you know, so severe. So what they did over time, and I looking back now, you know, in hindsight, I respect them for their decision, because at the core of what they were trying to do was to protect us. So it's understanding that, you know, that's that collective trauma. This experience that we've had is a collective experience. It's not just me having gone through that. It's not just my parents, but actually we went through that as a family. And so for them to retell me the story of how they had to, you know, risk their lives day in and day out, that takes a toll on them too.
Bilal, what do you think about the intergenerational differences around mental health and well-being?
Generally speaking, I think it's getting better across the board. Being a millennial, we're far more forthcoming and, you know, open and honest about mental health and the stigma that's attached to that. And I think that's, you know, we're making big strides towards destigmatizing mental well-being. People of my parents' generation are talking about it more. They are actually using words like depression. They are using words like anxiety. But how they're making meaning of that is a little bit different to how young people are making meaning of that. I think as young people, we're kind of, you know, we acknowledge that actually there might be a period where we have a depressive episode, but we can move through that. Whereas depression for the older generations is still quite stigmatized in the sense that, you know, that person over there has depression or they are depressed. And it's almost attributing that condition or that experience to who they are. So they're a depressed person as opposed to a person who's experiencing depression.
This is Dr. Angela Lim, co-founder and CEO of a mental health app, Clearhead, which is New Zealand's first AI-driven diagnostic and triage platform for mental health.
Because I think our health system, in many ways, think that wellness is the absence of illness, and that's completely not the same. And so if we truly want to flourish in New Zealand, that means we want to be able to allow people to answer the questions around, you know, what's my identity, what's my purpose, what's my meaning, not just do I have a mental illness.
When you're that third culture kid, it's not only understanding your experiences and your parents' experiences, but then having this constant, you know, every day you're going through different experiences of racism, of, you know, discrimination, of sexism, whatever it might be. And so not only are you trying to deal with all of this stuff that's happened in your past, but now you're tasked with dealing with all of this emotional labor that you need to be doing day in and day out, of processing why people are calling you certain things, why they're looking at you in a certain way, why you're being rejected from certain jobs, why, you know, your peers won't sit with you, or they won't, you know, want to sit near you, or they don't want to share their food with you, you know, whatever it might be. Your past and your present comes under attack in a lot of ways. You know, this concept of resilience is obviously a good concept, but actually in some ways it can be misconstrued, because it's like, you've been a refugee, so you should be able to put up with racism.
You should have
you should be resilient, you should have the capacity to deal with this. And it's like, well, I do have the capacity to deal with it, but I shouldn't have to.
In medical school, they teach us that at least 50% of our consultations in primary practice is related to mental health. But most people in the community don't realize that.
50%?
50% is related to mental health, and a large proportion of that is related to depression and anxiety, the two most common causes of mental health issues. The only good thing about depression is that it's treatable, definitely curable. But you need to deal with it. You need to face it, and you need to tackle it head on. And there's lots of services available to help with that. But again, if you refuse to acknowledge the problem that you have, or do not understand what it is about, then it's difficult to access the help required. Therapy is actually one of the best ways to deal with mental health issues, particularly things like depression and anxiety. But oftentimes they find talking to a complete stranger something to be completely alien to them and feel that it's not going to help. And that's why I felt, you know, telling people on a one-to-one basis very rarely works. I find explaining things to them from a community level and getting them to see that everybody's accepting this might actually normalize it for them and therefore be able to access it better.
Would you say that we've got a long way to go in terms of improving the way that we provide support for young people with refugee and migrant backgrounds growing up in Aotearoa?
Certainly, certainly. I think we definitely have a very, very long... We've got a lot of work to do. We have a long way to go. Like I said, mainstream services aren't... they're doing a great job, and this is not to discredit what they're doing, but they aren't reaching those hard-to-reach youth. They aren't able to provide that service to them. And so when you look at where refugee youth are on that,
spectrum.
On that spectrum, they're even more difficult to reach at times than the quote-unquote hard-to-reach youth. And they have, many, many layers of, to their identities and to the issues that they're dealing with. So as far as I'm aware, there isn't a single service that's catered specifically to the mental health needs of former refugee and third culture mined youth. You could argue that the proportion of refugee youth, as a total proportion of all youth, is very small. But it's not to say that their needs are any less significant or any less pressing than what mainstream youth are. And in fact, I think what you'll find is many of those experiences that third culture kids go through overlap with many other populations. Whether it's Māori youth in terms of the experiences of racism and being displaced from ancestral homelands. So if we're looking at the broad scheme of things, actually those youth who sit on the periphery or who are marginalised youth, not because of any of their doing, but actually because the system has failed them, there are plenty of groups, and refugee and third culture kids are actually in those groups. And unfortunately, it hurts me to say this as someone who is training to be a clinical psychologist. We just aren't serving them. We don't have services that are catered towards their needs. There's an expectation, for example, that they come to us as opposed to us going to them, or just very, very small things that can actually go a long way. Just understanding the complexities of identity and how race and gender and all those things play a part in the experiences of young people of colour in Aotearoa is very, it's very underserviced, I would say.
Bilal, this has been an incredibly fascinating conversation. I want to thank you for your time. People like you do give me hope in terms of being able to be responsive to the needs of our rangatahi, and I can't wait to see what you achieve.
Thank you very much, good.
Cheers. This series has broadened the conversation about mental health in New Zealand. Over the course of 3 episodes, we've heard about storytelling and mental health, growing up Afro-Kiwi and dealing with traumas of the past. But these conversations only represent a snapshot of the diversity of culture and stories of third culture kids. I hope that this series is the start of a much longer needed conversation about mental health in refugee and migrant youth.